There's two things you need to know when you get started in watercolor. The first, and probably the most important thing, is never mix your dirty water and keep it next to your wine glass or your coffee. I've made this mistake and I want to save you from making that mistake too. The second thing is you don't have to be good at drawing to be good at painting. The 300 paintings a year I sell plus is proof, because I am not a good artist. So let's get started. Since I'm not very good at drawing, hopefully you guys never ask me to show you how, because I strictly rely on my paintings and the paint. So we're going to just jump right in and talk about the two most common references in watercolor is what we call wet on wet and wet on dry. And wet on wet is basically wetting your paper first, like I did here, and then adding the color to it. And basically, there are so many different types of paints and paintbrushes and paper. I'm not going to get into that today because that's not important to get started in watercolor. You literally just grab watercolor paper, watercolor paintbrushes, and just find something on Amazon. In fact, I will link these exact materials that I'm using, and I think you can get all of them for fairly cheap. The brushes, the palette I'm using, and the paper, all pretty cheap. So what I want to say is right now, grab your paintbrush and just start mixing colors and seeing what happens when you add the color to the water. Make swirls, do dots, push your paint around and see what happens. Just get used to the feel of the brush and the wet on wet. This here is a wet on dry. It's pretty obvious, right? It's wet paint on dry paper. So as you can see, obviously a lot different consistency, but it's a great way to just really get used to how these two work. And each one has its moment. And you'll hear my tutorials, I reference wet on wet, wet on dry. This is wet on wet, this is wet on dry. And you'll probably hear that the most if you're in any watercolor groups, talking about technique and stuff. That's probably the thing you'll hear the most of. You'll hear them also get into the, what do you want, tube paints or concentrated or palette. I'm using a palette because it's probably the most common, but I personally prefer concentrated. As you paint more, you'll figure out what works for you. I say try it all and see which one you like. So I did the wet first, but I didn't put paint on there because I wanted to kind of show you guys what happens when you bleed the paint into the water. So as you can see, I did the tree in a wet on dry, and then I let the green go into the water a little bit. And as you can see, it has much different consistency. It's actually a really great way. It's funny because it's a great way to do a water reflection. How do you do a water reflection? Add water. So give it a try and just start doing some little, I don't know, clouds or trees or flowers, just little happy faces, whatever, doodle basically with your paintbrush. And it sounds boring, but it really will help in the long run in trying to get your feet wet, so to speak. And what I'm doing here is using the paintbrush to create shapes, and this is an easy way to make leaves. So the first one, all I did was literally press the paintbrush down, so the mop side of the brush basically made a little leaf. Practice lines. The best way to make a straight line is to use your whole hand and wrist instead of using just your hand. So don't bend your wrist, just keep it straight as if you have a ruler or taped to your arm, keeping it perfectly straight, if that makes sense. And then just keep practicing making straight lines. You just run your hand across the paper and that'll get you a straight line. Then add some colors to your, like if you just did this, I'm adding a darker blue. Try different colors, see what happens. Try reds, try oranges, see what happens when you add it when it's dried up a little bit, and just get used to watercolor, especially if you're coming from acrylic and oil. Whole different ball game. So let's make something fun and super easy, just to give yourself a little fun thing to finish up with. So you're going to draw a straight line like I mentioned, and then we're going to make leaves. So remember when I basically used a paint brush to make the leaves. So I'm just basically pressing the brush down and then lifting, and it makes the leaf. Isn't that easy? I love it. I love watercolor. So here I'm doing it in a different kind of shape because I want the leaf to go in front of the stem. I probably should have started with the flower itself first, because then it became harder for me to add the flower later because I had already done the leaves. But if you're watching this first and then going to paint, then go ahead and try the flower first and then add the leaves. Because as you can see, I didn't leave much room for a flower, but it's a good way to see, unlike acrylic and oil, you can't really add on top of watercolor. So if I tried to add a flower on top of these leaves, then it would just become muddy. I mean, I'd have to add a lot of paint and it just wouldn't look right. So if you're going to do this, try the flower first, and then you can have the leaves shaped around it. But otherwise, you know, just work with it like I did. And now I'm doing wet on wet. So I did the stem and the leaves wet on dry, and now I'm doing wet on wet. So in order to do a flower wet on wet, really easy. And like I said, if I had more room, I would have made a prettier flower. But check out my cherry blossom tutorial, which I have linked below, and it'll give you an idea of how to do some flowers, different types of flowers and stuff too. Also, I have a tutorial on a greeting card, and I go through a couple of different types of flowers as well. But this is just kind of, this is really how you do one petal, but I ran out of room. So I try to work with it. But you basically want to add colors to each end of the wet part and then help push it through. I live in a very, very dry climate. I'm here in the desert, so it dries very fast. I'm constantly having to add water. But you just want to add some color, and now I'm doing wet on dry to kind of give it a little bit of a petal around it. Just playing around. I'm not trying to create a masterpiece. I'm just trying to see what happens when I put stuff together. I don't know. Are there any flowers that are shaped like this? I don't know. I have no idea. I'm talking really fast for some reason. I have no idea why. I apologize. I would like to tell you that I've mastered speaking on these things, but clearly have not done that. So I'm going to add a little bit of yellow to the middle. I just want to see what happens. You know, add orange or keep doing pinks or reds, whatever you want. Literally just play with it and see what happens. And that's basically the whole idea of this video, is just to get used to the brush, the water, and the paint. So now after we're done with this, I'm still trying to make this poor flower work, but I don't know if it's really going to happen. I mean, maybe. So I'm sure whatever you're painting looks 100 times better than this. So what we're going to do after this flower is we're going to do kind of a fern thing, which we're going to use the brush itself to make the leaves, kind of like we did in that first video, but I'm going to put it all together so you can make one fern. It's really kind of a fun, simple effect. And also, what I'm doing before I jump into that part, I'm just adding a little bit of a darker green and a brown to the base of the leaf, just to make it look a little bit more organic. You don't have to do this. It's just, like I said, just try different colors, see what happens, mix it together and see if you like it, and just get used to it and keep doing this over and over again. So same thing with the stem, just a line. And you know, if your lines are kind of, they end up like looking like a Morse code, your brush is not wet enough. So if you're not getting a line that's clean like this, your brush isn't wet enough. If your line tends to spread, then it's too wet, not enough paint. So all I'm doing is pressing almost like stamps with the paintbrush, as you can see. And that's pretty much it. That was the fastest fern ever. So let me know how it worked for you. Welcome to watercolor. Hope you love it as much as I do.